Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. Today, we are diving into the rather colorful life and career of Johnny Paycheck, so stick around. All right, but first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. This Friday, the 24th, I will be at Red Bus Brewing in Folsom. And then November 1st, I will be at the R-Wagon Bar in Browns Valley for their Halloween costumes, so get dressed up and come on out. I will also be the costume judge for the costume contest. And then November 11th, I will be at Harrah's, Northern California in Ione, so come on out and see me. All right, we've got a new music alert, ladies and gentlemen. My latest single, High Sierra Coming Down, has just dropped and is available wherever you get your music. So go ahead and check it out, send it to a friend, and remember that's High Sierra Coming Down. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at TylerandCo_marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. All right, so Johnny Paycheck is another one of these characters that the more you dig in, I find it, I don't want to be too hard on people, and I don't want to just spend this whole show just, talking about all the bad stuff that people did, but Johnny Paycheck is kind of famous for that part of his life, and homeboy had some issues. He was a pretty rough and tough dude with a pretty nasty drug problem and a bad temper. And, he just seems like he's a musical legend, like all the greats reference him, and he's a great songwriter and he had a great voice, but man, he was tough to live with. So he was born in 1938. His name was Donald Lytle, and he was born in Ohio. And, there's not, also something to keep in mind for this episode, it's not like anybody was following him around writing down stories from his childhood or from his life, and even some of the stuff that he did later, I keep finding conflicting accounts. I ran into a little bit of this on the last episode with Patsy Cline, with people that are there are telling different accounts and different, wildly different versions of stories about stuff that happened. And the fun way to do it is to just tell them as if that's the truth, because, they said it, they were there. But like I said, there's some conflicting stuff, but we'll tell some of those stories anyway, just because it's fun. But so there's not a whole lot of information on his childhood, but I think he's one of 9 kids or something. And he did, he picked up a guitar, I think, when he was 6. So he's starting to kind of work on his musical chops here. And, he leaves home at age 15 to pursue music. So he seems to have known pretty early off that that's what he wanted to go do. So at 15, he moves to Nashville, and he's just doing anything he can do to make money. He's doing side jobs and probably some petty crime in here, knowing this guy now. He's doing whatever he can to, eat. And, but that, that doesn't last very long, and he doesn't get very far initially. I mean, he's 15, so, in 1956, he joins the Navy, thinking that would, provide some stability. And it does not last very long, because he is such a wild card. So so he's in the Navy from, technically, he's in the Navy for 1956 to 59. So there's a few years in there, but for a good chunk of it, he gets in trouble. I don't know the whole details of the story, but it ends with him punching a superior officer in the face hard enough to break his jaw, and some accounts say he fractured his skull. I don't know what the altercation was, but he basically just beats the brakes off of this superior officer guy. He gets court-martialed and sentenced to 19 years in prison, which obviously gets, reduced on appeal. Now, there's some confusion here because, so he serves, I think it was just over 2 years in federal prison for that. And when he gets out of prison, he jumps right back into the music scene. He goes back to Nashville, and this is where his career does actually start to get some traction. So he's playing, he's a really talented bass player. So he's, getting work in all these different bands, all these different, cool people in music history. But he hasn't slowed down at all. There's no, I don't think he learned anything from his time in federal prison there, because he's doing stuff okay, so he's touring with, he's not in Patsy Cline's band, but he's on the same circuit. He's in another band that, is around Patsy Cline. And this is where he also starts using the stage name Donnie Young. And this is where he's in interactions with George Jones and Merle Haggard, and I think Waylon Jennings is in here, but it's all before they're all famous, and they're all just kind of the up and comers on the scene. And so sometime, I think it was in 1960, there's a crazy story where they're playing at a fairgrounds or something with Patsy Cline, and after the show, Johnny Paycheck just gets in Patsy Cline's car and drives off, and people were aware of it fast enough. They closed the gate to the fairgrounds, but Paycheck just keeps driving around in circle, and he's drunk and screaming at people and probably doing coke and whatever else. And he's but he just drives Patsy Cline's car around the fairgrounds till it runs out of gas. And that sort of ended his professional relationship with Patsy Cline. but just stuff like that, just this zero forethought, and just that seems like fun. I'll just take Patsy's car and just, get away with it for as long as I can kind of deal. And this is also where, kind of in that same period of time, he meets Hank Cochran, which, if you remember from actually, I think just in the last episode, we talked a little bit about Hank Cochran. He was a songwriter, producer, but he was also the music, the song buyer for, it wasn't Decca Records. It was, the record label will come to me. I had it written down here somewhere. But so Hank Cochran is the guy that drove the car with Willie Nelson in it to Patsy Cline's house, and Willie Nelson didn't want to get out of the truck. That's the same Hank Cochran who has developed a friendship with Johnny Paycheck and is kind of mentoring him around and kind of encouraging him to write and kind of getting his career going. But in 1960, right after that, so late 1960-ish, Johnny Paycheck goes back to prison for desertion. So I don't know what the circumstances were of when he got out of the Navy after he served his prison sentence. Maybe he was supposed to go back into service for some, I don't understand exactly how this happened, especially because it was, a year later, or, at least several months later, after he got out of the service, had time to be out there driving, stealing Patsy Cline's car and meeting all these people. The Navy comes and finds him, and they put him back in prison for desertion. Desertion and escape from military custody, which, like I said, the details of that story are pretty vague, but so he goes away again, does 2 more years in New Hampshire, and so he gets out in 1963, and he goes back to Nashville, and this is, he kind of just picks his career right back up where he left off, but this is where he meets George Jones, and he joins George Jones's band as a bass player. And he starts to, like I said, he's developing his reputation this whole time as just this kind of wild drinking buddy type dude. But, and so he's playing bass for Ray Price. He does, let's see, a couple other, notable bands, and he starts to get his own music going. So he signed with Hilltop Records in 1966. So after a few years of just kind of putting around the scene here. But the late 60s is where we start to hit some real, as if all this up to now wasn't bumpy enough. The late 60s, it gets even worse. Let's see here. Because, he, at one point, even in the 60s, he ends up like homeless in Los Angeles for a minute. Because his whole thing, by the way, like, because he grew up poor, there's a story about him winning like $5 at a talent show when he was a kid, when he was like 10 or something. And the story with that, like $5 in 1950, whatever, was like $60 today. And when you're a little kid, that's a lot of money. Even then, he immediately goes out and spends it all on records and candy. Like, he doesn't save any of it. He just burns it all the next day. And that is the type of guy he remained for his entire career. He was just burning money through stuff. And he liked to be seen having money. So he would, like, at one point he had a vest with like 10,000, like much later after Success Comes, he has a vest that he wears with like $10,000 in it. And he would, every once in a while, he'd like pull it out on stage and count it and then put it back in his pocket. He would do all kinds of crazy stuff on stage like that. But he realized that he's just this real loose cannon. There's not like, at least from what I can tell, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of saving grace here. It's not like, oh, he's just such a nice guy, except when he's drinking, or he's so this, except when he's, on drugs or whatever. He seems to have kind of just been a hellion no matter what. And the more success he got, the more it just amplified that. I'm other than him being a good friend to his friends, there's not a lot of redeeming stories here. And, but okay, so we're in the 70s. And this is where he meets Billy Sherrill, Billy Sherrill was the producer and songwriter who worked a lot with George Jones and Tammy Wynette. Like, he was really heavily involved. We talked a little bit about him in the George Jones episode. And so it's, he's right in there with him in that same, and this is also, by the way, in the same time, this is where George Jones is doing the Donald Duck and the Old Man and kind of having his own come aparts and stuff like this. Paycheck is in here in the mix for the whole thing. And, but then in 1972, he's arrested for check forgery. He's just writing bad checks to people. And, so I don't think he goes to prison for that. Oh no, he does. Okay. Yeah. I forgot about that. Okay. So check forgery in 1972, he served 11 months and 29 days and, which he put into a song later. But he starts releasing. He's releasing songs all through the 70s here. He's got like a Song and Dance Man, Mr. Lovemaker. He's kind of, as fast as he's self-destructing, he's also achieving some success. So he's kind of just like canceling himself out, maintaining the same level here. Let's see here. He kind of keeps that up through the 70s. 1979, his former manager hits him with a civil lawsuit over, fees and everything else. And then 1981. So like we're blowing through a lot of time there, but he's kind of just on, autopilot, just being a hellion, making money, but just causing problems everywhere he goes. And then so now we get into the 80s. Now what sticks out in my mind is that, like, when we tell these stories about everybody, by 1980, a lot of the old guard guys have kind of got their act back together. Like, the 80s, that stuff was sort of starting to slow down for the kind of the OG crowd with, like, George Jones and Merle Haggard and all these guys. Like, they were successful, and those guys were sort of established. So their days of beating people up and shooting at people was, pretty much behind them. George Jones fired a gun over the top of his friend's car somewhere in there, but it was before. I think that was in the 70s. Anyway, so 1981, he gets kicked off an airplane because he just gets in an argument with a flight attendant on a Frontier airline. Frontier, I don't know if it was Frontier Airlines, but whatever airline it was. He gets in this nasty fight with the flight attendant, gets kicked off the plane, and then the flight attendant sued him for some kind of damages. It was like libel or some kind of whatever. But he ends up settling that out of court. So I don't know what kind of a scene you have to cause on an airplane to end up having to pay out the stewardess, but he did. And things from there take a very dark turn, because he also in 1981, so soon thereafter, he ends up in Wyoming. And this part of the story is where I kind of hit it and went like it makes it kind of tough for me to, like, it makes it tough for me to hang in there and still be a fan, because in 1981 he goes to Wyoming and he plays a show. There's some kind of interaction after the show with a woman that was there. He ends up back at that woman's house, and she has a 12-year-old daughter who apparently there was some kind of, like, she comes out after, and the 12-year-old daughter accuses Johnny Paycheck of statutory rape. And the defense and reactions afterwards are infuriating. So basically, somehow he's able to talk the prosecution down. Nowhere in this did they say, no, he didn't, sexually assault that kid. The defense was, no, it was a drug deal misunderstanding. Which is like, how does that work exactly? Like, oh, it was just because he made a bad deal with the mom? Like, it's so dark and so just like, what are we doing here? And like I said, very difficult to kind of get. I mean, I don't care how many drugs he's on. I don't care how drunk he is. Like, that whole interaction is just, you ought to bury people under the jail for that kind of stuff. But it doesn't seem to slow him down very much here. So, but he just pays $1,000 fine, and he's given 1 year of unsupervised probation. And then there's a $3 million civil suit later, but it never reaches trial. So I don't know if that got like settled out of court or something. I don't know. But yeah, so Johnny Paycheck gets himself in trouble with a 12-year-old girl in Wyoming, which really kind of takes the wind out of the sails for the rest of my interest here. But it's fine. I mean, not fine. But the story continues, I should say. Doesn't get very far. 1985 is probably his most famous brush with the law, where somewhere in there at like between 81 and 85, there's a story of this weird interaction that he had. I think it was outside the Ryman, actually. And this woman comes up to him with a gun and is like, we're meant to be together. You're going home with me, or I'm going to kill both of us. And somehow Paycheck is able to like talk her down and kind of get out of that interaction, and he leaves. But after that, he starts carrying a gun with him everywhere he goes, which was not that abnormal at the time. And you got to remember that this is like Jerry Lee Lewis is shooting his bass player with a .357, and there's, George Jones is shooting over the top of his friend's car, and there's like the people are shooting at each other at this stage of the game in country music, I guess. I don't know. And but anyway, so he starts carrying a .22 caliber pistol, and it kind of becomes part of his shtick. Like, people know that Paycheck's carrying a gun, and there's some accounts where he would put blanks in it, and during the show he would like fire blanks on stage and like get the crowd going, I guess. But anyway, like I said, he's a pretty wild dude here. So then, 1985, he has a disagreement with a guy named Larry Wise. And there's a bunch of different versions of the story. There's a bunch of different accounts of what happened after. But the gist of it is, there's an argument, and Paycheck pulls his gun and fires it at Larry Wise, striking him in the head. But it doesn't, it just somehow, like, he just grazes him, basically. It was, grazing him might be an understatement, because it made him permanent, like, it gave him permanent hearing loss, and, lots of stitches and stuff, obviously. So the guy goes to the hospital, the guy survives, but the interaction is super weird, because, like, so Paycheck shoots him, and then gets up and grabs that guy's hat that had the bullet hole in it, and runs outside, and gets in his car. And there's, one account says that, like, the guy he shot manages to like leave the scene, but then Paycheck's out there yelling like, "Come back, Larry, I'm not going to shoot you anymore." But obviously Larry does not come back, and Paycheck gets in his car and drives off. He flees the scene, and he tosses his gun out of the car somewhere, and he ends up getting pulled over, like I think a couple of towns over or something. And when the cops find him, and this, like I said, this part of the story is uncorroborated, but I've heard it told this way. When the cops find him, he is slouched over with a shattered bottle of Jack Daniels in the floor of his car. The car is running at a gas station when the cops find him. There's the bloody hat in the floorboard, and the radio is just blasting "Take This Job and Shove It." So he's like listening to his own hits, and a coke and alcohol-fueled rage drives off, ends up at a gas station, passes out in the seat. They arrest him. And he's convicted of aggravated assault and evidence tampering because of, taking the hat and the gun and all that stuff. And he's sentenced to, I think it was 7 to 9.5 years, which he appeals. I think he goes to prison for 22 months for that deal. So he's back in prison in 1989. And, like I said, he does 22 months, and he does, like, to his credit, I guess, that does seem to be a turning point for him. Like, so while he's in prison, which was not an easy time, by the way, apparently he does get, like, stabbed in prison. He's getting in fights all the time. He's, like, it's not an easy road for him at all. But he, by the time he comes out of prison, he's, like, a born-again Christian. And suddenly, a big chunk of his persona is like trying to bring people to Christ kind of thing, which, I mean, he does with limited success, but this is, this is where, and he files for bankruptcy because he'd burned through all of his money, and, after legal fees and everything else, like the IRS is after him for like $300,000 or something. And, so after that time, and actually while he's in prison, I think Johnny Cash and George Jones go visit him in prison while this is happening. And they're doing things like they're throwing little like benefit dinners to pay for his medical bills and his, legal fees and stuff. Like his friends are trying to help him out. But it's a pretty, bottomless pit of money at this point. And, and you got to imagine too, like, there's a big shift going on in country music from the late 80s to the 90s. Like there's a, because while he's gone, other guys are entering the scene. So this is where like Alan Jackson is getting going and Vince Gill is getting some steam. And they're, like the kind of new wave of 90s country is starting to pick up a lot of steam here. Everybody acknowledges Johnny Paycheck for his songwriting, and he's kind of one of the musical heroes kind of thing. I also don't know if at the time how much of the whole statutory rape thing was really brought out front and talked about. Like, I don't know, without being there at the time to know what those conversations were like around it. It seems to have pretty much been swept under the rug at this stage of the game. And he was just the crazy guy that shot somebody, which is wild enough on its own. But he gets out and he gets, there's a story from before this where like he's enough of a drunk hellion. He's playing the Opry and he's so messed up that he throws up in the wooden circle at the Opry. So like, for those of you that don't know, the Grand Ole Opry was at the Ryman Auditorium until I think the late 70s or the early 70s. And then it gets moved from the Ryman to where it is now. And they took the Ryman stage, like the wood from the Ryman stage, they cut the circle, like where the main microphone is, they cut like a 6-foot circle out of it, and they took that wood and they put it in the same spot in the new stage. So, and it's this, everybody that plays the Opry, like it's the same pieces of wood that like Hank Williams stood on, and, everybody, every name in country music up to that point is like this, hallowed spot where you're standing in the wooden circle. Johnny Paycheck goes up there and throws up all over it and like tries to continue his show, and he ends up getting like hauled off, and it was just this unmitigated disaster. And so he's banned from the Opry for a while. until he's like in 1996. So this is many years later, after prison, after he gets out, and he's kind of restarted. This is where you find all these interviews with Johnny Paycheck where he looks a lot older and he's kind of back in polite society. And he's getting interviewed, and he's on all the music shows. You can find footage of him on like George Jones's TV show and like a bunch of other, of the TV circuit at the time. And he's kind of this sweet old man character, and he's just telling stories, laughing with Merle Haggard about, oh, we got to come up with stories we can tell on the air and blah, And so he's got this fun old timer personality going, and nobody asks him any questions about the prison time or the other stuff that he's got going on. But so much so, like, he patches up his reputation enough that he's invited back and joins the Opry in 1996, which I think is kind of nuts, but okay. And he starts, and then in 1997 is his last, like, real big chunk of success here, where he does a duet with George Strait called Old Violin. And that's, it's like I said, for all of his faults, he's a great songwriter, and he maintains success for a reason. And but that, like I said, that's 1997. He does Old Violin, and and George Strait and Alan Jackson, all these guys, they're they look at him as this musical hero. He wrote obviously he wrote songs for David Allan Coe and for, he's written for tons of people. But I do think, obviously, like, his legal troubles were enough to keep him somewhat out of the spotlight. It wasn't like he never reached the same height that George Jones did or that Merle Haggard did or any of these guys. Like, he didn't get to that same peak of success. He was just this, like, outlaw background character for a lot of it. But he had, he had his own following. There's a funny interaction where, like, Willie Nelson's talking about how, like, it's Willie's show he's playing, and he brings up Johnny Paycheck, and the crowd goes nuts, and Willie's kind of like, yeah, they call me an outlaw, like, kind of joking about all of Paycheck's storied history here. And but anyway, he's that kind of guy. And so he played his final show in 2001. His health is falling apart. So he's got emphysema from smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day. He's completely broke. He never financially recovers from all that stuff after the bankruptcy and after his legal fees and everything else. So you get this kind of tragic burnout at the end, where, like, basically the end of the story is Johnny Paycheck dies pretty much penniless in a nursing home in Nashville with, like, a nurse in the room. The sad part of that story is his son was on his, like, they called his son to tell him, hey, like, your dad's on his way out here, you probably ought to come see him. And his son was driving to the nursing home and got there 20 minutes after he died. So his son never got the chance to say goodbye, kind of thing. So he ends up dying in a room just with the one nurse that was watching him, and no fanfare, no, kind of just a kind of sad ending for a dude that is so highly regarded in the songwriting community. Like I said, I get kind of doing this show and digging into people's histories and stuff. Like, there's sometimes you find, like, Jerry Lee Lewis is the other one that we did that I just, man, after digging in, you're like, man, you do your best to, like, separate the art from the artist, but man, we think, like, right now everybody's pissed at Zach Bryan for jumping over the fence and wanting to fight Gavin Adcock. It's like, that is child's play compared to what these guys were doing, in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And, think about that. Like, to be the kind of dude that is shooting a man in the head in the 80s. Like, this is not, like cell phones are, like, right around the corner. Like, this isn't old history. It wasn't just like, oh, this was back in the day before. Nope. Like, not that long ago. And Johnny Paycheck's the kind of guy that is going to pull a gun out and start shooting at people. And like I said, he's just a general, just fights all the time, just assault charge after assault charge left and right. I mean, he kind of, this is the stuff we've talked about is just the stuff that he actually got like caught for. You could go down the YouTube rabbit hole on stories of Johnny, the stuff he got away with that he never got arrested for, punching people in the face and doing like just a crazy unhinged dude. And yeah, like I said, the statutory rape thing really sticks for me. Like I have trouble being a fan after I dug into all that and kind of saw how that went, especially when you realize that like how that got handled is a real miscarriage of justice. Like that dude should have spent the rest of his life in prison. And it's not like, he got away with that. He didn't do, and he paid $1,000 fine, and like the system just let him go and continue on to have this successful career. And like I said, it's one thing to judge, here we are decades later, but man, that's all I'm going to think about now, listening to that guy's music. That really bothered me. And, but like I said, I mean, it's not like he was the only one. What's funny, I found some irony in like Jerry Lee Lewis, after we told his whole story of burning his life down and having the 14-year-old wife going to Europe and like all this like the Jerry Lee Lewis story was another super frustrating one. But like Jerry Lee is in a position to like raise funds to try to help Johnny Paycheck with his legal bills and his medical bills and everything else. Which by the way it wasn't just like a overnight, oh yeah, that worked. There's stories of, I think it was the event that Jerry Lee put on. I think it was either Jerry Lee or George Jones. They put this dinner on and they only made like $1,400 or something. So it was just like a drop in the bucket of what they were after. So my sense is that maybe the public was aware, and maybe by that time people were kind of not in a hurry to be very supportive, which, yeah, you'd have a tough time selling those tickets now with the internet and everybody knowing things. But anyway, like I said, you have to know all that in one hand, and then also just know that the art is out there. And that art had an impact. It's part of the story. It's part of the American music canon. And that's what this show is all about, is trying to figure out the history and where all our stuff came from and kind of find these people's stories. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There's some real dark stuff out there. And Johnny Paycheck is one of those guys. So... But, I mean, yeah, like I said, and it's all just self-inflicted, wild, it's like completely unnecessary. So, and it kind of, I'm going to keep going on about this, but like it bothers me a little bit when like the outlaw image, right? The whole like outlaw country, this outlaw country, like I said, like, like the stuff we have going on now with like the beefs and stuff, like guys trying to be these like outlaw dudes, like Zach Bryan doing his whatever, and Gavin Adcock getting in trouble all the time and picking fights with guys like Charlie Crockett on the internet and whatever. It's like they're trying to emulate that outlaw image because everybody knows that mugshots sell t-shirts. Like that's true. Like Morgan Wallen tossing chairs off of buildings and stuff, like it's all sort of an outgrowth of that culture of just not caring and just being this, just consequences be damned kind of attitude. But it's like, man, that bothers me, that it's like Johnny Paycheck's part of that culture. It's not all like, it's not just Johnny Cash, who then later got his life together after he, broke the set in anger. But anyway, it's just, yeah, it bothers me to see that kind of stuff going on now, because it's like, what are you trying to be, like as cool as Johnny Paycheck, the guy that went to prison for, like all kinds of stuff and got away with statutory rape? Like, is that what we're trying to be like? I don't think so. I think that's probably not a very lofty goal to set for yourself, but controversy sells, and that's the world we're in. But yeah, all that to say that we can definitely do better, and many artists did do better, and there are artists out there that really, lived pretty upstanding lives and had pretty fantastic careers out of the deal and are worth emulating. But nobody's out there trying to dress like Marty Robbins, or even Conway Twitty or any of these other guys that just kind of did it right. So that's a little bit of a bummer. Not to bring the show down right at the end, but I was pretty bothered by some of this stuff. I'm just tired of digging into these stories and finding all this stuff that's like, what's with all the underage girlfriends and what's with all the statutory rape stuff? Like, it's all over the place in all these stories we've done. And it's a little disillusioning sometimes, but yeah, it's definitely part of the story and it's worth telling. So that, not to end on a bad note, but thank you guys for watching. That's Johnny Paycheck, and we will see you next week.